My name is Cordelia Roberts. I'm a PhD researcher at the Marine Biological Association, and I study the role of microbial eukaryotes in the ocean. I'm really interested in sort of like functional things, so things that hold like such a big importance. So in the ocean, these sort of microorganisms take up about 2/3 of the biomass of the ocean, whereas things like animals like whales, dolphins, fish, they take up the other third. So they're actually super abundant and super important in terms of the biomass that they produce, but they're very, very important, and I think that importance is what drives me to want to sort of study them more, and also to be able to communicate that to society. So microbes in the ocean are incredibly important when we think about the climate, and I think there's this decoupling that we have as humans to think that the ocean and the climate are completely separate. So things like microscopic algae such as phytoplankton play an incredibly important role in drawing down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So during photosynthesis they take up this carbon dioxide, and actually the best part is that when they die they sink out and they form this beautiful thing called marine snow, which when it sort of like sinks down in the water column, it fades from this sort of browny green colour that they have into this white against the dark blue of the deep sea, and that sinks and falls into the deep ocean. And there's loads of microbial action that happens on that as well. So depending on where a particle falls within the water column, so from the surface to the deep sea, we call that the water column, and where it sinks, depending on where bacteria, fungi, archaea, even viruses to a certain extent, which these little particles are such hotspots of diversity. Depending on where that gets remineralized, so where things respire on it and produce their own carbon dioxide, is actually really important as to where that carbon dioxide then goes. So it can either keep sinking that particle, and if that particle reaches the deep sea, then that's a really and into the sediment, that's a really great way of locking carbon out of the atmosphere. But let's say if it only reaches 50 minutes before it gets respired and remineralized, then actually that carbon dioxide can come back out into the atmosphere and be climatically active again. So it's actually really interesting when we think about the speed that these particles can sink out, which can be impacted by lots of different things, such as like sandstorms that will ballast these particles and make them sink faster, but also what these particles are and just generally who's interested in degrading them. And if we don't know who's degrading these or who's interested in respiring them, then we can't really input and inform climatic models, which actually, because the ocean takes up so much carbon, it can provide such a big inaccuracy in these models. And so thinking about the ocean and the climate and how they're coupled together is actually really important and of real interest when we think about what manageable actions we can take, and how different things like governments can actually reduce the amount of carbon dioxide that they're putting out into the atmosphere, and sort of the regulations around that. So I think this research area of marine microbiology and looking at the marine microbiome is a really important area that should and can contribute to the UN Decade of the Ocean. So when we think of the ocean, we might not even realise the impact that it has on our lives. You know, these microscopic algae, they take up carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and they remove it, and they can potentially draw that down and take it into the deep sea and sediments for up to thousands of years. But I think moving forward we should really have this idea of moving from what's in an environment, so which bacteria, which fungi, which archaea, which viruses, which phytoplankton are there, into what are these doing, and actually why should we care about it as a society. So I think we should be moving forward with that, but also we should move forward with as we're doing that, communicating that to the public. So we're saying, actually, this is the reason why we're doing that, and this is why you should be interested. And also just bringing those people in and getting them involved. So, you know, getting people involved in citizen science projects of how they can sort of do their own sampling. So we have this thing called World Ocean Sampling Day, where people could definitely get involved, and I think we should definitely look towards a real big push across the globe into how we can get people involved in an inclusive and an exciting manner, because I think it can be so difficult for people to conceptually grasp this idea of a marine microbe if they've never seen it before, and also, and very importantly, if they don't know the purpose or the reason why they should care about that organism. I've been very fortunate that it's always been a very freeing and safe space for me, and so I spend a lot of time in the water reflecting about, I guess, my research sometimes when it gets a little bit too intense, but there's always a curiosity around it when I'm in there and sort of thinking about why something is somewhere, and so in some ways it stimulates my research further, but I guess that sort of mental calmness that it provides, and yeah, just a lot of joy and friendship too.